Hello and welcome to a special edition of Know the Truth. I'm Philip de Courcy, pastor of Kinwood Community Church and Bible teacher on the daily radio program Know the Truth. And I'm coming to you live in the studio here in Santa Ana with kwve 107.9. Appreciate the partnership I have with this station. And we've thought for the last few weeks, given the situation we're dealing with in our state here in California and certainly across the United States and the world at large, that it might be good if I just came live from the studio and addressed the issues of our day from a biblical perspective. And I've been finding that a joy, and I hope if you've listened to the last couple of broadcasts over the last couple of weeks, that they have been a blessing to you. Now, what I've been doing is bringing you a kind of Reader's Digest version of messages I'm actually preaching at my church here in Anaheim Hills, California, Kinwood Community Church. We've been doing a series called Statements of Faith. We've been looking at some of the Psalms that have a message of confidence in God, and I've been sharing that with you. If you want the full messages, you can go to our church website, kinwoodchurch.org, and you'll find them there, the full version of what you're hearing tonight. And I want to take you to Psalm 11 tonight. I want to speak on the subject, fight or flight. You know what? Some years ago, the British novelist J.B. Priestley was asked to write a short article on his religious beliefs. And interestingly, he declined. And he declined for this reason. He said at this point in his life, he was more able to deny than to affirm. What he was saying is he didn't really have much faith in God. But he did say this wistfully, having said that he was more able to deny than affirm. He said this, "I regret this, because now is the time for gigantic affirmations." I love that. He's saying, look, what history needs is hope. What people need to hear is a message of calm and confidence, and I really can't offer them that. What we need in our day is gigantic affirmations. And you know what? That's why I've been going to the trust Psalms, the Psalms of confidence, where the psalmist affirms his trust in God, gives testimony to the fact that in trials and troubles, amidst tears, that God has proven to be sufficient, that God has been his refuge and help and very, very present help in time of trouble. And you have in these Psalms gigantic affirmations. And I'm going to look at one more tonight, Psalm 11. Psalm 11 begins again with an affirmation of faith, with a testimony of trust in God. Listen to David in Psalm 11. "In the Lord I put my trust." Last week we looked at Psalm 16, and it began with similar words. "Preserve me, O God, for in you I put my trust." So let's look at this psalm. There's three things I want to say about it as time allows. Number one, I want us to consider what I call the counsel. David is given counsel, and the counsel is to flee. We're not sure of the background of this psalm. Some argue we may be dealing with the jealousy of Saul. Some argue we may be dealing with the treachery of Absalom. But whatever the circumstance, panic launched this psalm. David's advisors, maybe an inner circle of friends, looking out on the situation that's unfolding, they say to the king, they say to David, you know what? You need to head to the hills. You need to be like a bird that flies to the mountains. That's what we read in verse 2. "How can you say to my soul," says David, "flee as a bird to your mountain? For look, the wicked bend their bow. They are ready with their arrow on the string. They will shoot secretly at the upright of heart, and the foundations are being destroyed, and what can the righteous do?" David's friends are basically saying this, folks. The kingdom can't be saved, but the king can. And so, David, you need to preserve your life. You need to live to fight another day. And the better part of valor would be to flee, to leave. We see from our text that there's political intrigue. The language here of the wicked bending their bow, of the arrow already in the string, if we were to put that into kind of modern language, we would be saying this, that the assassin's finger is already on the trigger, and that David is in the crosshairs of the assassin who lies in the shadows ready to strike. There was political intrigue. David's life was under threat. Secondly, there's political implosion, because we read here about the foundations being destroyed. And then what can the righteous do? From what we can tell, that's the language of social order. That's the language of tradition and custom. And so we can read into that at some point in David's history, probably as king or king in waiting, that everything around him was in chaos. That there was political intrigue going on, and the social fabric of the nation was being torn apart. There was moral collapse. Nothing was stable and nothing was sound. And in the middle of all of this, here's the counsel: flee. And we're going to deal with that tonight. But let's be honest. I think this is well-intentioned. I think his friends or political advisors are well-meaning. They're saying, you know what, David, there's really nothing more you can do. No point falling on your sword. Maybe the better power of valor is to retreat and live to fight another day. It may be well-meaning, but the temptation is to flee. The temptation is to panic. The temptation is to run. And I want to say nothing more than, you know what, given the situation we're in, I guess elements of that is a temptation we're all facing. Where do we turn? I mean, our confidence as a nation is being shaken. Will we have an economy when we go back? Some of you have learned this week that perhaps you've been furloughed or lost your job. Panic, anxiety, fear and frustration is gripping the soul of our nation. What are we to do? Panic, flee, run? Like a bird, fly away? Maybe the better analogy, do we take the kind of ostrich and just stick our head in the ground and hope this all passes away? So that's the counsel. Now let me just give you a little thought, since we're dealing here with the analogy of a bird flying away to the mountain for safety. This isn't the first time David's faced this temptation. If you go to Psalm 55, it's a psalm that deals with treachery and trouble in David's life. In that psalm, David says, "Oh, that I had the wings of a dove, that I might fly away and be at rest." This isn't the first time David has faced crushing circumstances that has tempted him to act like an ostrich or to take wings like a dove. I remember reading something the great Bible teacher Warren Wiersbe said: "Don't pray for the wings of a dove that you might fly away. Pray for the wings of an eagle." Because you see, the dove tries to fly ahead of the storm. The eagle can fly above the storm. And those that wait on the Lord, they can renew their strength. They can mount up with wings as an eagle, and they can run and not be weary. And you know what? At times like this, both personally and nationally, let's not pray for the wings of a dove that we can just run from our trouble. Let's pray for the wings of an eagle. Pray for God's strength and ability to surmount the circumstances. So let's move on. Not only do you have the counsel, but you have what I call the conversation. Because if you look at verse 1 again, here's what David says: "In the Lord I put my trust." And then he says this of his counselors and his friends. Did you notice this? "How can you say to my soul, flee like a bird?" He's actually questioning their answer. He's taking issue with their advice. It was well-meaning. It was well-intended. Let's be honest, given what is likely happening here, David's life is under threat. The bow is being made ready to shoot. There are people lying in the shadows to kill David. The foundations of the nation are being shaken. Makes sense, doesn't it? But David concludes it's the voice of fear rather than the voice of faith. And so he questions it. Why do you say to my soul, flee? I'm not sure that's the best advice. Now, here's what I find interesting about this. David challenges the voice of fear. David confronts the anxiety that's gripping his friends. And they're passing on that anxiety to him. And they're telling him, your only option is to flee. And so David challenges that. And I want you to notice that he doesn't address the Lord directly. "In the Lord do I put my trust. Why do you say to me?" And I think you and I want to see, here's this counsel, flee. But here's this conversation now between David and his friends, between David and the Lord, so to speak. David brings their advice, which is fear, out into the open. And he addresses it before the Lord. He doesn't address the Lord directly. He addresses the Lord indirectly. And he says to his friends, why do you say to my soul, flee? I'm going to put my trust in God. God's going to help me to stand. God's going to quiet my nerves. God's going to remove my fears. God's going to give me a confidence that he is sovereign, that he will provide for me, that he will preserve my life, that God's in the midst of all of this muddle and mess. And I find that very challenging. He talks out their fears and his fears before the Lord. And can I say to you tonight, that's a good thing to do. That's a really good thing to do. If you've got fears, if you've got anxieties, talk them out before the Lord. Be specific about your fears. Name them. Talk to other believers about them before the Lord. Address them. This isn't the first time David has encouraged us to talk to yourself. David has talked to himself. David speaks to himself all the time. David has a conversation with his soul all the time, pointing his life in the right direction. Remember in Psalm 103, verse 1, he says, bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me. Bless his holy name. David's saying to himself, praise, worship, adore. David's taking himself in hand. In the Psalm 42, verse 11, what does David say? Why are you cast down, O my soul? And why are you disquieted? Trust in God. Hope in God. You will yet praise him. David speaks to himself. And that's a good thing to do. Listen to Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones, the great English Calvinistic pastor who wrote a book on spiritual depression. And he said this, and I think it's very helpful. Have you realized that the most of your unhappiness in life is due to the fact that you're listening to yourself instead of talking to yourself? Take those thoughts that come to you the moment you wake up in the morning. You have not originated them, but they are talking to you. They bring you back to the problems of yesterday. Somebody is talking to you. It's you talking to you. Yourself is talking. Now, the man's statement in Psalm 42 is this: instead of allowing this self to talk to him, he starts talking to himself. Why are you cast down, O my soul? He asks. His soul had been depressing him, crushing him. So he stands up and says, self, listen for a moment. I will speak to you. I find that very helpful. Did you hear that? In the morning when you wake up, don't you find yourself talking to you? Oh, poor me, and what's going to happen next, and what if this doesn't happen, then we'll be in the soup, and that kind of conversation that goes on. In fact, you didn't really generate it, you're just waking up, and yourself is talking to you. And Lloyd-Jones is saying to us, and David is giving us this example, why do you say to my soul, flee? Talk to yourself. Talk yourself back towards God. Talk yourself in a voice of faith and confidence. Remind yourself that the Lord is your light and your salvation. Whom shall you fear? Remind yourself that he will never leave me or forsake me. Remind yourself that all things work together for good. Remind yourself that David once said, I once was young, but now I'm old, and I've never seen the righteous forsaken or his seed begging bread. Remind yourself of things that yourself wants to forget, that fear wants to shut out. In fact, let me quote someone else. Max Lucado, in his book Fearless, says this: be specific about your fears. Talk to God about it. And I love what he says here. Putting your worries into words disrobes them. They look silly standing there naked. That's good. Let's move on. Although before I do, I want to say this. Maybe you've just tuned in, joined us in the last few minutes. Well, you're listening to a special edition of Know the Truth. Usually at this time at night on kwve 107.9, you're listening to a pre-recorded broadcast of Know the Truth. And that broadcast is taught by myself. I'm Philip de Courcy. I'm the senior pastor of Kindred Community Church in Anaheim Hills here in Southern California. But along with the great folks here at Kwave 107.9, I've decided to come in each Wednesday night and speak to you live from the studio, and that's what's happening. And we're looking at some sermons I've been preaching over these last couple of Sundays, and we'll be preaching over the next couple of Sundays, Psalms of Trust, a series I've called Statements of Faith. We've been looking at some of the Bible's Psalms that express trust in God. These are challenging times as the coronavirus continues to spread across our country. Our president and his advisors have asked us to continue these limits on our travel and sheltering in place for the next 30 days. These are upsetting times. We're hoping for the best as a nation. We're preparing for the worst. And I want to speak peace into troubled hearts. I want to take the Word of God and bring it to your situation. And so we're looking just for a few moments here at Psalm 11. I'm just preaching a part of a sermon I just preached in our church on Sunday. You can get the full message at kindredchurch.org and hit the media button, and you'll find that series, Statements of Faith. We have looked at what I call the counsel. David's friends have counseled him to run, to flee. And often that's a temptation, to bury our heads like an ostrich or to take the wings of a dove and fly away. But as Warren Wiersbe said, pray not for the wings of a dove, pray for the wings of an eagle, that we might fly above the storm, that we might wait on the Lord and know a peace that passes all understanding. Following the counsel to flee, you have what I call the conversation. David takes issue with their advice. He believes their answer is wrong. He doesn't want to flee. He wants to stand his ground. He wants to prove victorious. He wants to show that the grace of God is sufficient and the peace of God can guard his heart. And so he took issue with that, and he reminds himself of certain truths, which brings us to what I call the confidence. The confidence. David shows a certain confidence in God here. He tells us in verse 1 that he's going to trust the Lord. And then 4 times after that, he mentions the Lord. Did you notice that? If you've got your Bible open at Psalm 11, having said in verse 1, in the Lord I put my trust, he then keeps that as his focus. Verse 4, the Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord is on his throne in heaven. The Lord tests the righteous, verse 5. And the Lord is righteous, and he loves righteousness, verse 7. While he doesn't disagree with his friends, where he can see what they see, he sees more than they see. He sees the Lord high and lifted up. He sees a sovereign God. He sees a God who weighs man's actions in his balances. He sees a God who will judge the wicked who hurt the upright. And he sees the hope of someday looking into God's face. Now, we don't have time to develop all of that, so I'm just going to take 2 of those thoughts. What I call God, the fact that God rules, and the fact that God reviews. Let's look at this first thought. God rules. In the midst of the crisis and in the midst of the chaos, David reminds himself that God's throne transcends the moment and the mayhem. That's verse 4. The Lord is in his holy temple. Is that the earthly temple? No, because we read here, the Lord's throne is in heaven. God, there is a throne. There is a sovereign. There is an authority that transcends the moment any one of us is in. That's a theme throughout the book of Psalms, God's sovereignty. That God is in heaven, sitting on a throne, doing whatever pleases him. Nothing takes him by surprise. As Adrian Rogers used to say, that the Trinity never meets an emergency session. We read in Psalm 45, verse 6, that God's throne is established forever. And so while the foundations of the kingdom of Israel was being shaken, when things looked chaotic, when things looked to be a mess, when men didn't have full answers to great questions, David reminds himself, David reminds his friends that God is in charge of the situation. Habakkuk 2:20 says that God is in heaven, let the earth be silent. Psalm 46 verse 10 reminds us to be still and know that he is God. And we looked at that the first week in Psalm 46. I just want to remind you tonight to be still. Don't let panic grip your heart. I'm not minimizing the heartache. We're losing some good Americans. This is a challenge to our economy. But I believe that God is sovereign. I believe that God is doing something in this, that God is doing something that's invisible in the visible world. There is a sovereign hand and a providential hand at work in all these circumstances. And when things look out of control, David reminded himself that they're not out of control. And David reminded himself that he was never in control. Situations like this remind us, even remind our government, that we don't have total control on life. Here we were as a nation, sailing on calm waters. The economy was up. Our economy was the envy of the world. Things were looking good on many levels in our country. And wham, we run into this iceberg called the coronavirus. And it reminds us of human frailty and the limits of human leaders in politics. And we are reminded indeed to keep our eyes on the Lord, that the Lord is in heaven and there's a throne in heaven and God sits on it. And we need to keep our focus there, and we need to find our peace there. I was listening to a message by Tim Keller on Psalm 11, and he gave this analogy I find very helpful. He said, you ever watch, sometimes we buy these little plastic steering wheels for our kids. Sometimes it's girls, but mostly it's boys, and you've got a little boy sitting at the back of the car in his safety chair, and we have attached to his safety car this kind of plastic dashboard and a plastic steering wheel, and he's sitting there back there imagining that he's driving the car. Well, he's not really. It's an illusion. Dad's driving the car. Mum's driving the car. And you know what? Tim Keller would remind us in that analogy that sometimes we have this illusion that we're in the driving seat. But we're not. God is. And God's got a good driving record. And God's driving human history to a particular end when His kingdom will come on earth and His will be done on earth as it's done in heaven. And so let's not panic. Faith is a refusal to panic. Let's keep our eyes on heaven's throne. Here's the second and the last thought. God rules and God reviews. One of the striking things is, although God is on His throne, He's not idle. He's not inattentive, because verse 5 reminds us the Lord tests the righteous. In fact, verse 4 reminds us His eyes behold and His eyelids test the sons of men. While God is on His throne, He's governing human history, and He's weighing men's actions, and on the basis of those actions, His judgment will come. He will reward the righteous, and He will punish the wicked. But I'm just interested for a few more minutes here on this idea that He tests the righteous. Can I remind you tonight, if you're a believer, that all disasters are tests. All disasters are tests. God's testing us right now. He's testing the quality of our faith. He's testing the quality of our walk with Him and our worship of Him. Troubles expose sins in our lives that need to be repented of. Trouble exposes things that we hold too dear and we give an importance to that God doesn't. We make idols of. Troubles expose our lack of obedience to certain commands. Troubles call us to worship God at a level of confidence in Him that only trouble can generate. Trouble encourages us to love each other in a way we haven't. I hope you're passing the test. I'll finish with this. In 1895, Andrew Murray was in England suffering from a bad back. He was staying at a particular home, and while he was resting there and having his breakfast brought to the room, his hostess told him that there was a woman downstairs who had found out that the great Bible teacher was in that house and had come to ask him for counsel. She was going through a rough time, a terrible time. And so she asked, did this man of God have any advice for her? And here's what he wrote down and told his hostess to give to the lady. He said this, "In a time of trouble, say to yourself, first, God brought me here, and it is by His will I'm in this strait place, and in that I will rest. Next, remind yourself He will keep you there in His love and give you the grace to behave as His child. Thirdly, he will make this trial a blessing, teaching you lessons he intends you to learn, working his grace throughout it all. And fourthly, in his good time, he will bring you out of it again, how and when he knows. Therefore, remind yourself, I am here in this trial by God's appointment, in his keeping, under his training, for his time. I think that's helpful. And David grasped that when he was being counseled by his friends to run and panic and surrender to his enemies and don't express a bold faith in God by obedient action. He challenged his friends and he reminded himself he had reasons to trust. And we have just looked at two of them. God is sovereign and God is in charge of the situation. And number two, God is testing you. Don't fail the test. Don't run. Don't panic. Embrace the test. Let God teach you lessons. Well, I hope this little excursion into Psalm 11 has been a blessing to you. These are days when the foundations are being shaken. These are days when we're tempted to fear rather than express faith. But these Psalms of trust remind us these are days for gigantic affirmations. I call you to put your trust in God. God bless.